Emily Waitt is the clinical director of Kincove, an adolescent-focused therapy practice here in Los Angeles. She trained at the Maple Counseling Center and has held school-based placements at Beverly Hills High School. Emily earned her undergraduate degree from Brown University and is currently completing her doctorate in clinical psychology. In my personal experience with Emily, I found her to be smart, thoughtful, and deeply understanding. Emily, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, of course.
Today we're going to talk about the challenges that are specific to teen therapy.
Okay.
So, when parents and teens are on completely different pages, how do you approach your work with the teen?
Yeah, I think often parents and teens are on different pages. I think when working with the teen, especially at first, it's important to really just validate what they're coming in with. I think at the outset, setting the frame, saying, hey, I'm not going to tell your parents this. I might share updates with your parents with your consent, but outside of the things we need to report, like this all stays here, because I think that allows for the safety that they need to feel to kind of open up. But then also modeling like curiosity and, about other perspectives, about the parent's perspective, about why they feel the way they feel. But I think at first you really have to align with the teen because a lot of times teens feel misunderstood.
What do you do if you also see the parent's point of view, though?
I should definitely see the parent's point of view. I think, just like the teen, the parent's a person with their own set of experiences, and there's reasons why they feel the way they do. There's reasons that it's a dynamic, right? There's things coming from both sides, and I think my goal with the teen would be and the parent, I would want to talk to both sides and try to kind of model that curiosity, try to get them to think about why they might be, why the parent might be doing what they're doing, kind of trying to think about the parent's history, how did they grow up? And I think helping the teen to do that once you've kind of set up that relationship, that trusting, safe relationship, exploring what's going on for the parent and building empathy, I think that is ultimately often the path to a better parent-child relationship.
Okay. So it's important for everyone to acknowledge everyone's point of view, just in due time.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean, acknowledging, validating doesn't necessarily mean you're agreeing, but I think acknowledging that that's the way someone feels, that's definitely important. I think that's what's missing in a lot of teen-parent relationships is that it's really hard for the parent to understand why the teen is making the choices they are.
Yeah.
But, there's reasons, and I think just like the teen probably has similar thoughts, like why is my parent making my life super difficult? But I think for a therapist, seeing both perspectives is super important for parents and teens, trying to build that, trying to get them kind of more, they're not gonna be on the same page, but if, they're here and we can bring them here, even that's progress.
That's a win. What makes a parent-child relationship uniquely challenging? Are there common patterns you see in therapy? Is it different from treating other relationship dynamics like couples?
Yeah, I think, so couples are peers, right? Couples are the same age. There's not this power dynamic, this power differential where one's a parent, one's an adult, one's a kid. And I think, for teens and parents, it can be really difficult because the parent is used to the teen or to their kid being, responsive to what they want them to do. Usually for kids up until 10, 11, 12, they're pretty, attached to the parent. They're pretty aligned with what the parent wants. They're pretty, for lack of a better word, obedient. They'll follow the rules and stuff. But then as they get into their teens, they start to kind of want to separate. And that's completely normal and adaptive. But parents often struggle with that because the dynamic has changed and that feels really uncomfortable. It doesn't feel as safe to not have as much kind of say over what your child's doing. So I think for the parent to kind of get used to the idea that my kid's growing up, they're going to start to want to figure out who they are, what their values are, what they want from life. I think some common dynamics are, the rebellious teen and the controlling parent, the pursuer, just like with couples work, the pursuer, distancer, where the parent's on top of the kid just kind of wants to keep pushing away and they get further and further apart. Yeah, I think that's most commonly what we see when someone comes in is that they've just gotten to this point where parent feels like the kid's not listening, kid feels like the parent doesn't understand, and that just keeps going back and forth until they're at a place where they really can't see eye to eye.
Got it. It's natural for teens to want to rebel. What's age appropriate and what's cause for concern?
Yeah, so absolutely it's natural for teens to rebel. They're trying to launch into adulthood. You have to build that confidence. You have to kind of give them the autonomy to make their own mistakes. That's how people learn, right? I think it's completely normal to see mood swings up and down, right? That's going to be normal. High emotionality, that's normal. I think, pushing back on rules, that's normal. I think when you have to kind of worry is if you see, not ups and downs, if you see just someone persistently, chronically feeling down, feeling angry, if they're putting themselves in risky situations, if you're seeing unhealthy coping skills like substance use, I think, when it starts to get in the way of their everyday life, if a kid is, moody or having kind of anxious outbursts every once in a while, that's completely normal. But if it becomes something where they can't go to school or their grades are slipping, I think that's when it's time to either reset something yourself, seek help from a therapist. I think, because, during that age, that's when like 75% of mental illnesses, they appear around age 14 or by age 14. And so it is a time to really kind of make sure your kid is building up this resilience.
Mm-hmm. I like what you said too about there's being rebellious and there's being unsafe.
Yeah.
Difference there.
Definitely a difference. And I think it's hard to find that line. And I think, sometimes teens are also secretive and you don't know what's going on. But I think if you have that sturdy relationship, it makes, your kid's going to come to you if something's stressful, if that relationship is in place.
So I hear two valid but different messages about schoolwork, right? I hear this from my peers, other therapists. I hear it a lot from parents too, right? And I hear it from the kids. And one is there's more to life than grades, right? So yes, work hard, but if you're constantly afraid of failure, right, the pressure will ultimately harm your mental health. The other point of view is saying, no, excelling at school is actually pretty good for mental health. Yes, the stress is real, but succeeding builds confidence in one's abilities over time. I sort of feel like there's a false comparison here, but I do notice those mixed messages, and it feels like a bit of a double bind. Do you have a take on this?
Yeah, definitely. I think, there's truth to both perspectives. I think it absolutely can boost self-esteem to do well in school, but unnecessary and extreme pressure can be bad for your mental health. And I think it is something that's kid to kid, person to person, based on their own interests. Some kids aren't into school, aren't great at, traditional learning environments, but they're great at music. And I think when a parent is kind of wanting their kid to do well and that pressure comes from, or if it's from peers, teachers, whatever, but if there's a external pressure rather than the teen coming from an internal place of, hey, I value academic success, I have, goals for the future that I want to meet, and these are the things I need to do to get there. I think that's a little more adaptive. I think when you start to see, breakdowns over a B+, when you see kind of extreme pressure where kids are kind of procrastinating, putting things off until the last minute, and then needing to panic to get things together, I think that extreme pressure is going to ultimately harm the teen.
Mm-hmm. Can you share an example of a small or even unexpected shift that made a big difference in how a teen navigated a difficult relationship?
Yeah, so I used to work with a teen girl. I think when I met her, she was around 15, 16. Her and her mom got into this dynamic where girl would get home from school and mom would immediately pepper her with questions about her day. Mom was more, anxious and maybe a little more hovering, and her daughter was a little more, she was someone who was a little more avoidant. She wanted to work on things on herself, and she'd get home from her day of school and feel kind of already, tired from the day of socializing with people, having to worry about school, and her mom starts asking a bunch of questions, right? On top of that, mom checked grades daily on the, online platform, which I think a lot of parents fall into that trap of, over kind of monitoring their kids. And so anytime grades or school was brought up, this girl would get reactive, and then they'd end up in a, argument. So we decided to do this thing where, she'd get home from school, and if she wasn't feeling like talking, she'd put this little red card on the fridge, and mom would just say, hey, okay, I need to talk to her in a little bit after she's kind of had some space to herself. On top of that, we did instead of a daily checking of grades and daily bringing that up, kind of setting a time once every week or 2 weeks to say, hey, like this is the time where, I'm worried I saw you didn't get your homework in for whatever class. And that shift, like their whole parent-child dynamic really shifted. They also started doing this thing where they would journal, they would write each other things back and forth because the dynamic had gotten very explosive and, you know, the girl was very reactive to her mom. Then mom would get kind of reactive in return and it would just escalate into something it didn't need to be. So they really did get a lot closer. The dynamic was way easier. And actually she started doing better in school.
What a nice story. That's nice. That was a nice case. In your work with teens, what are the most common co-parenting challenges you see between divorced parents, and what's one thing that almost always makes things worse?
Yeah, what makes it difficult is when there's different rules at different houses. That kind of sets up a dynamic where the teen's gonna, pick a parent that's easier to deal with, and they're gonna kind of align more with that parent. I think anytime the parent is sending the kid as a messenger, that's not helpful. I think something that's gonna always make it worse is a parent airing their frustrations towards the other parent to their kid. I think that's only gonna either cause frustration towards the parent that's venting to them or frustration towards the other parent because they're hearing about all the awful things that they've done to this parent. I think parents really need to get on the same page. Something as simple as, I worked with a young girl who parents were divorced and dinner was at 5 at mom's house and 7:30 at dad's house, and that was messing with her sleep schedule. And I think really kind of having the parents focus on, okay, what is best for our kids in this scenario, and having to put their own emotions aside, which I know can be really difficult, but it is necessary for your kid's success.
How do you help teens set up healthy emotional boundaries and speak up for themselves with adults, especially in moments when the conversation is getting heated? And since everyone's definition of disrespect is different, what guidelines can help families navigate these moments without shutting each other down?
Yeah, that can be tricky. I think with teens, you want to teach them kind of assertive communication, not aggressive communication. Assertive communication where they're, respectful, but also kind of focusing on their needs, saying, I feel like this, I need this in order to be able to do X, Y, or Z. But I think it's something where each family is different, right? So it's not for me to say what is disrespectful, what is kind of the rules that they should be doing in their communication. But I think it is important for both parent and kid to have buy-in in that kind of situation. So we talk about boundaries, we talk about the rules. Okay, these are the things that, the parent needs from their kid. And I think kind of co-creating that makes everyone feel like it's fair, they know what to expect. And then just making sure in back and forth, there's no name calling, there's no, as soon as you start to notice kind of activation where there's raised voices or tears or anything that's kind of a show of emotion dysregulation, I think you need to take a pause because one, the teen's not gonna hear anything you have to say when either person is upset. So you're not gonna get your message across, and if anything, it's just gonna cause more stress and make, both parent and teen feel less understood.
Are there specific exercises, activities, or rituals you recommend for building connection when a relationship is strained?
Yeah, I think it's important for parents and teens to connect outside of kind of the day-to-day, whether it's, asking about grades or kind of telling them they can't go out till a certain time, setting the curfew. I think a lot of times we get in kind of a, just we're going through the motions of doing things. We're not actually taking the time to connect with the people in our household and our family. I think kind of having time where there's no phones, where there's actual true connection, finding positive activities to do with each other that have nothing to do with, what's going on in your day-to-day life, whether that be like cooking, hiking, going to a museum, whatever kind of the kid is interested in, kind of trying to find a way to connect with their interests, show that you're curious about them, that you think that their interests are cool. I think kids do want to feel seen. And then I think, expressing gratitude if it feels like something that they can do, if they're in a good place to do that. And then sometimes, communicating what's working, what's not, kind of like a stop, start, keep, saying, hey, I don't appreciate when you scream at me, but I really like that you've been, giving me space when I get home from school. And I, would like if you started kind of, being a little calmer when you ask me to do X, Y, or Z. And I think opening up that communication, validating each other's feelings, that can really make the connection a lot stronger.
Yeah. So like a little space that's safe And then specific times for feedback.
Yeah, because I think there's just so much that you get in the day-to-day when parents communicate with teens. It's often like a request or a demand, and the teen starts to feel like, no one's actually hearing me, no one's seeing me, I'm kind of disconnected.
Okay, let's have a hypothetical case, because I want to get your take on it. Let's say we have a 15-year-old client named Emma. Her parents are successful, ambitious, and constantly traveling for work. Over the past 6 months, when they are home, conversations with Emma almost always turn into lectures about grades, study habits, or college applications. Emma tells her friend she feels like a project instead of a daughter, that her parents are more interested in shaping her than knowing her. She's spending more and more time at her best friend's house, where she feels heard, relaxed, and free from judgment. Her parents notice the distance, but when they ask what's wrong, Emma either shuts down or says nothing. In their view, they're working hard for her future and trying to keep her on track. In Emma's view, they're never around. And when they are there, they make her feel like she's not enough. The standoff is growing. She feels resentful and misunderstood. They feel unappreciated and worried she's pulling away. So my question for you would be really twofold. How would you conceptualize this? And then how would you actually talk to everyone involved?
Yeah, I think this is a pretty common dynamic, right? I think the parent is trying to do what they feel is best for their kid. They're trying to set them up for success, maybe do what they feel like they could have used or what they didn't have. But I think when you kind of aren't connecting with your kid, when you're not showing them that you value them intrinsically outside of their achievements, I think if you're not showing interest in their interests, if you're not taking that time to really value the relationship, they're not going to listen to anything you say, right? I think they don't feel that connection. They're going to look for guidance elsewhere, whether that's from a peer group, and sometimes it's a peer group that doesn't necessarily build great habits. Sometimes their, guidance ends up in a place where you don't want them to be, or they'll look for it, like you said, at a best friend's house. If a parent there is more understanding, more kind of interested in their life and what they're doing, I think that really will, they'll want that. They'll gravitate towards that, which I think makes a lot of sense.
I like that.
I think also in the example you bring up, like it sounds like the parents don't have much time to do that. So I think it does need to be an intentional kind of process where you're saying, we have to set aside this time, just like a time for a meeting. We have to set aside a time to connect with our daughter, to see how she's doing, to kind of, yes, check in on how she's doing in school and whatnot, but to also just check in on her. What is she doing? What does she like about the friend's house? Be curious. What is it that the parents could do to make her feel more understood? I think on the teen side in this dynamic, it sounds like she's pretty self-aware. She's aware of what's going on. I feel like a project. I don't feel like there's that connection. So she's coming in stating her exact needs. I would really want from my parents to value me outside of my academic success or my future goals or whatever it is. And so I think kind of in that situation, it's really on the parents to kind of meet her there, because that's completely valid. Kids need structure, but they also need warmth. They need some guidance. They are kind of coming to this time in their life where they're more independent, but they still need structure, and they need people who are kind of, soft places to land if any issues come up.
And you would communicate that with the parents?
Yeah, and I think I'd also want, depending on the situation, I'd also want them to hear that directly from Emma, to hear, what is it that makes her feel that way? What is it that the friend's house gives her that she could kind of try to find at home? Because ultimately, you want her to still hang out with her best friend, but you also want her to feel accepted, seen, understood, where she, with her parents.